Okay. Well, I'm going to continue where we've kind of left off. We've got all of the Jacob and Esau things, and as I said, Rabbi Jonathan Sacks has such excellent commentary on things, and he did 3 essays on this aspect of the Jacob and Esau struggles and who Jacob is and why Jacob is a model for the Hebrew people and what faith is like and what he has revealed about the relationship between the Israelites and God. And I got through a couple of those essays last week, but this last one, and then as soon as we finish with this concept, then we'll get back to the next phases of the journey of the people of Israel. So, he mentions that Jacob is not, at first glance, the most obvious figure of the Tanakh to represent and epitomize the Jewish people. And he mentions there's other compelling alternatives within the patriarchs. It says Abraham, who began the journey with his faith and his trust to go where God had told him to go. And then Isaac, the first Jewish child, and his special trust. And then Moses, who took the people from slavery to freedom and gave them the most precious possession, their Torah, or the law, as we call it. And then David, Israel's greatest king and poet, and even Isaiah, the great visionary prophet. Any one of these could have been a model, but each of them had different qualities and characteristics. So why is Jacob the preeminent model? And then he goes on to, there are other phrases in Scripture, and one phrase, or one who struggled with God and with men and has overcome, as the most common characterization of Jacob and the Jewish people. But then there's others. He says in Exodus, God summoned Israel to be a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. And we hear that phrase, a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. And then Isaiah speaks of Israel as a covenant for the people and a light for the nations. That's one of the very strong prophetic aspects of the role and purpose of God's people, special people, to be a light to the nations. If they will follow God and practice the disciplines of the following all the laws and rules of justice and interaction between people, that they will create an ideal community, and all the rest of the world will be jealous, and they'll be drawn to the light of the quality of their community life. And then there's another one that we have, not by might nor by power, but by my Spirit, says the Lord Almighty, from Zechariah 4:6. So there'll be a spiritual people, and they will influence others, not by power and might, by domination, but as a quality of following God. Anyway, he goes on and then lifts up a fella that he thinks has expressed some important analysis. It's Nikolai Berdayev, and he lived from 1874 to 1948, and he was a Russian intellectual, and he was initially a Marxist, and he broke with that movement after the Russian Revolution and its aftermath and the death of freedom. He saw that, well, that's not working. And he became an unconventional Christian. He went from being a Jew to a Marxist, and then he moved to Christianity. But then he was charged with blasphemy for criticizing the Russian Orthodox Church in 1913. And then he had to go into exile, and he settled in Paris. Now, this guy sounds like a loose cannon. So why would he pick him? Well, he picked him because in his writing, he wrote a book, The Meaning of History. And in it, he writes a tribute to Judaism. And Sachs quotes it here, and he says, Berdaev, I remember how the materialistic interpretation of history, and a materialistic interpretation is just looking at the processes of how history works in a non-spiritual. God is totally out of it. It's just the workings of the materialistic world. I remember how the materialistic interpretation of history, when I attempted in my youth to verify it by applying it to the destinies of people, it broke down in the case of the Jews, where destiny seemed absolutely inexplicable from the materialistic standpoint. Its survival is a mysterious and wonderful phenomenon, demonstrating that the life of this people is governed by a special predetermination, transcending the processes of adaptation expounded by the materialistic interpretation of history. The survival of the Jews, their resistance to destruction, their endurance under absolutely peculiar conditions, and the faithful role played by them in history, all these point to a particular and mysterious foundation of their destiny, which we would say, well, he's talking about God. He's talking about the spiritual that they demonstrate that contradicts the materialism, the dynamic of Marxist, of his philosophy of how history works, and has a very materialistic and economic basis. Anyway, Berdaev believed that Jews and Judaism were profoundly wrong about the central question of human life. He says they were obsessed by a passionate idea of justice and its terrestrial fulfillment, meaning on earth. They believed that redemption could be achieved on earth. The intense Jewish striving after truth, justice, and happiness was responsible for the perennial restlessness of the Jewish spirit and its revolutionary expression. Berdaev regarded Marxism as a secularized version of the Jewish belief in the Messianic age. Now, Marxists kind of believe that history could come to some ideal resolution, and one of those ideas that perfection could be achieved if you just follow the right formula, and everything would work out. But then, as we see, there's twists and turns that mess things up. Anyway, Berdaev's own view was that this is an error and an impossibility. Human destiny, whose pains and torments can in no wise be redeemed within the narrow limits of a single life, finds its fulfillment in another life. Truth, justice, and happiness belong to heaven, not earth, Berdaev is explaining. The world to come, not this world. The immortal soul, not the mortal body. He who believes in immortality ought to look soberly on this terrestrial life and realize that it is impossible to achieve a conclusive victory on earth over the dark, irrational principle, and that sufferings, evil, and imperfections are the inevitable lot of man. Now, Berdaev, he believes, framed the alternatives sharply and correctly. And he says that in most places, the classical function of religion through history has been to reconcile people to the random brutalities of fate, the injustices of society, the triumph of might over right, the brevity of life itself, and the pains and disappointments with which it is fraught. It says 1,000 different ways religion has represented an alternative reality. I mean, there's reality. There aren't different kinds of reality. There's just reality, isn't there? Well, we would think so, but whose reality is correct? People have different views of what's real and what's true, and each one thinks their own reality is the truth. Otherwise, we wouldn't have arguments, and we wouldn't have political parties, and we wouldn't have different philosophies. But it seems like there ought to be one reality, correct? It's just whoever grasps that reality just can't explain it to all the rest of the dummies that don't accept that reality. Is that correct? So, anyway, there ought to be a reality, one, but there are alternate views of that reality. So, in 1,000 different ways, religion has represented an alternative reality, and that is a haven in the heartless world, an escape from the strife and conflict of everyday life into the quiet spaces of the soul, or of the thought of life beyond death. Religion, faith, spirituality, these words conjure up ideas of peace, serenity, inwardness, meditation, calm, acceptance, consolation, and bliss. Does that ring true with anybody? Sorta? Not? Yeah, well, anyway. Judaism is intellectually, spiritually, and emotionally the great exception, he writes. For we believe that sufferings, evil, and imperfections are not the inevitable lot of man. They are not woven in the fabric of the universe that God created and pronounced 7 times good and very good when it gets to human beings. Justice, freedom, human dignity, equality of respect, integrity, and compassion are to be fought for here, not in heaven. The sages said, and this is some of the old Jewish sages, that when Moses ascended to heaven to receive the Torah, the angels objected. How could God entrust His most precious possession to mere mortals? Are there murderers among you, said Moses to the angels, that you need to command them, you shall not kill? Are there adulterers among you, the angels, that you need to be told, you shall not commit adultery? The Torah was not given to the ministering angels, but to humans, because humans need it. And in giving human beings free will, God expressed His faith that one day they would learn to use it responsibly and morally, and thus create a world of societal beatitude. In Berdyaev's view, it represents the perennial temptation known as Gnosticism. Anybody heard of Gnosticism? Gnosticism. Anyway, he makes a brief explanation. It's a complex doctrine that can nonetheless be summarized as this world bad, the world to come good. Ultimately, Gnosticism is incompatible with monotheism, for why would a good God create a universe in which sufferings, evil, and imperfections are inevitable for man? Why create a species, Homo sapiens, in His own image and likeness only to subject it to inescapable pain? Gnosticism played a considerable part in early Christian life of the church, and many previous lost Gnostic Gospels were rediscovered by the Nag Hammadi manuscripts found in Egypt in 1945, 2 years before the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered. Anyway, Gnostics held that the physical universe was created by a demiurge, a lesser God, and that the true God, the God of the Spirit, has no place on earth. It's a dualistic philosophy or theology, and probably what the sages are referring to when they spoke of the people who believed in 2 divine domains. Now, Gnosticism sounds ancient and arcane, yet its appeal is timeless and powerful. We still have folks who still kind of think in those terms. It is not easy to reconcile the existence of God and the commands of faith with the world as we know it, fraught with tension and tragedy. It's easier intellectually and psychologically to think of religion and God as belonging in different dimensions altogether. in heaven, not on earth, somewhere else, not here, life after death, or the immortal soul in a meditative, calm, or mystical withdrawal. So religion can make us indifferent to the world or reconciled to it. Indifferent because this is not where God is found, or reconciled because in some way human suffering is the will of God, for which we will be rewarded in the world to come. And that's what Karl Marx meant when he wrote his famous line, and this is the full quote. Usually we just have the last phrase, but religion is the sigh of the oppressed creature, the heart of a heartless world, the soul of a soulless condition. It is the opium of the people. Now, because we are so... I always thought it was opiate, but I've been hearing more often call it the opium of the people. Religion is the opium of the people, or the opiate of the people. Seeing how Marx wasn't talking English, the translation could use the opiate or opium, either word, and get the same idea. It's a drug to try to numb our pain. It's a drug to escape reality and the challenges. That's alcoholism, and a lot of drug addiction begins as someone's answer to their problem. They self-medicate to ease some sort of emotional, or with prescription drugs, it's a real physical pain that they can get addicted to. Anyway, so he's saying the Jewish approach is different. Indeed, Europe did not develop an activist approach toward poverty and suffering, freedom and democracy, industry and economic growth, and the beginning of a classless society until in the 17th century Christians began reading the Tanakh again, or their scriptures, and it made possible the invention of printing and the availability of Bibles in the vernacular translation. This gave rise to Calvinism. He thinks is the closest Christianity came to Judaism, and it was responsible for the English Revolution and the faith of the Pilgrim Fathers who created the modern Americas. Well, he says Berdaev was right to see that this belief in the redemption lies in this world, not in the next, was responsible for all the features we associate with Jacob and Israel, and the people who bear the name of one who struggles with God and with men and prevailed. If you believe that truth, justice, and happiness are to be pursued in this world, then you must struggle with this world. And that's an important distinction that he's lifting up, that is a part of the Jewish heritage and the Jewish ethos. Sometimes this meant struggling with idolatry, superstition, paganism. We hear about the prophets are talking about the children of Israel. They've gone to worship the other gods and the the fertility gods and so forth. And so they struggle against that reality in the world. And so the prophets are trying to tell the people not to do that, and that God is different and they should live differently than their neighbors. But this means wrestling with those things in their day. But now, he says, the issues today are secularism, materialism, and consumerism that are the things in the world against which faith has to struggle. And there are times up until the 19th century when much of Europe was illiterate and Jews alone practiced universal education. There were others in the 20th century, for example, times when Jews became the targets of fascism and communism, systems that worshipped power and desecrated the dignity of the individual. Judaism is a religion of protest, a countervoice in the conversation of mankind. And what he says, what that means is struggling with God, as Moses and Jeremiah and Job struggled with God. And then he states, no other religious literature, certainly not Christianity or Islam, do we find human beings arguing with God. And he says, recall that there are not heretics, that is not the heretics who do this in Judaism, but the exemplars and role models of the faith. We remember Abraham, when God comes, the three strangers come and have dinner with him, and two of them go off down to Sodom, and one stays with Abraham, and then God is telling God's self, I really ought to explain to Abraham what I'm about to do. So he explains what is about to happen, that Sodom's going to be destroyed. And then Abraham argues with God about, are you going to destroy all the people just because a lot of them are evil? What if there are 50 righteous ones there? Will you destroy the 50 pure and righteous ones along with all the evil ones? And then the phrase is, shall the judge of all the earth not do justice or be just? If you slay the innocent, that is not just. Can God, can you do that? So that's the arguing with God there. So if justice belongs on earth and not just in heaven, then we may not accept seeming justice. We must protest against unjust things. Indeed, it was God himself who empowered Abraham and Moses to do so. So Judaism is not an escape from the world, but an engagement with the world. It does not anesthetize us to the pains and apparent injustices of life. It does not reconcile us to suffering. It asks us to play our part in the most daunting undertaking ever asked by God of humankind, to construct relationships, communities, and ultimately a society that will create a home for the divine presence. And that means wrestling with God and with men and refusing to give up or to despair. And he says, Jacob exemplifies this more than Abraham or Isaac or anybody else. Anyway, but it's he says it's hard to be a Jew when we have such a faith. Now, in response to that, I had some reflections. Some scholars reviewing the writings and history of the early church and Judaism at the time of Jesus have written that Christians and Jews were not opposed to each other as much as they were opposed to this Gnosticism that Sachs speaks of. They had struggles with each other, but they each saw the Gnostic philosophy as more threatening to their understanding of the faith than the competition between Christians and Jews. They were strongly opposed because Gnosticism was a heresy that would pervert and destroy the fundamental truths and view of both Judaism and Christianity in its dualistic cosmology. And the dualism, like he said, that's pointed out, this world bad, heaven good, material people bad, our physical being, our life here evil, corrupt, bad. The only good part is to live in the Spirit. The spiritual life is the only good, and that as quick as you can, die to this body so you can go to heaven. During the Great Plague, the Black Plague, and poverty, sometimes that makes sense. Anyway, but the Gnostic view is the wrong answer to what is called theodicy question. Anybody heard that word, theodicy? No. No, it kind of sounds like that, like democracy, theodicy. But it is, if God is all good and all loving and all powerful, then how does evil exist? How does suffering exist? If God is all loving and all powerful and all knowing, how in the world does evil and suffering exist? Anybody got an answer? You're on the right track. Freedom of choice. But the Gnostic answer to this theodicy question is by saying God is all loving, God is all good, and God is all powerful, but God lives in another realm. God has nothing to do with this world, this earth, where the evil and suffering exist. What is happening is there is an evil power here, and that evil power has a name. Satan, or the devil, is that power. And in and there's a big battle. God's in heaven, Satan's down here or in the underworld, and there's a struggle for the hearts and minds and souls of humanity. So the human beings, we should despise our physical material existence and try to be spiritual and uncorrupted, and not be drawn to the lustful desires of materialism, and leave this material world as soon as possible and live in a heavenly world. But the evil world is ruled by another God, and the Gnosticism, real easily, as it developed in Judeo-Christian circles and around early Jesus time, grabbed a hold of the Satan from biblical stories and elevated the Satan to another God, a God equal in power to the Creator God. And so this Satan figure grew and grew in their stories and in their theology. But Gnosticism took on many different forms. People used the dualism, and then as they dealt with different questions, they would develop some different ideas. And in the basic dualism, some thinkers and writers with this Gnostic dualism would, one version in Christianity was that the Old Testament God was the bad God, because the Old Testament God created the materialism, the physical world, with the lusts and temptations, with the suffering of the flesh, and that God was not a good God. But in the New Testament, then Jesus and the Holy Spirit become the true God of salvation and are entered into the heavenly realm. And so some of the Gnostic interpretations that happened within Christianity was that got to this heresy that Jesus really wasn't physically real. He was like an image. He didn't have a real physical body, so he couldn't have suffered and died, because that just can't be in this dualistic world. So it twisted and perverted a lot of the understandings. Let's see. And part of it was to reject Judaism and the Old Testament as having to do with that old God, that bad God, and so we only get into just Christianity and Jesus, who really wasn't born of the flesh. He wasn't truly incarnate. It was just an image. And so anyway, a lot of ideas where Gnosticism twisted things around with its dualistic foundation. However, in casual observation, we do tend to see that there are struggles between good and evil, right and wrong. We have struggles within ourselves, our own conscience, to do the right thing, the unselfish thing, and then times we want to be selfish and greedy and so forth. If on the plate there was only one cookie left, and it's your favorite kind of cookie, and it's you and somebody else, if you can get there first, will you offer your favorite cookie to someone and say, or do you compromise? Well, let's break it in half. But anyway, this struggle is within all of us. But we can see that there seem to be opposing forces in our world and in our lives and in ourselves, and we feel the pull and the draw. We often see in struggles in human society that we demonize the opposition. We tend to see the other as all bad or all corrupt and warped, or deem them as in league with the devil or something. In wartime, a part of this is an emotional process that we have to do to be able to kill other human beings, is to demonize the enemy, to make them less than human. In World War II, Japanese weren't the Japanese people, but the Japs. Vietnam, it was the Gooks. Because it's easier to demonize the Indian. In American Indians, during selling our country, they were savages. They weren't noble people. As a way to make it easier to kill other people or to dominate them, to see them as less than human, subhuman, we are superior, call them animals, easier again to engage in warfare and to kill other human beings and not feel bad about it. And then to look at ourselves as pure and just and good and so forth, and that God is on our side, or we're on God's side, to justify our position. And then if God's on our side, then the others must be doing something bad. They must be evil. It's an evil empire. The axis of evil, as Bush said, taps into this dualistic kind of mentality that's still with us and still operates. The Shia and the Sunnis, they're of the same basic religion, but they demonize each other, and it goes back into their old history. In Ireland, the Protestants and the Catholics demonized each other. But anyway, once the war starts, then inevitably there is collateral damage when non-combatants, innocents, women and children are killed, either accidentally or strategically. Sometimes it's to demoralize the enemy. Give up before all the ones you love are killed. Surrender. Or to get even, retribution. Your attack killed ours, we're going to get even, we're going to kill yours. And so it just goes on and on. On an ideological grounds in struggles, those on one side will see themselves as the good and their cause is good. However, they often exercise the philosophy that when we get that way, if our cause is good and just, then it's easy to make decisions that the end justifies the means. If our cause is just and our goal is honorable, then to get there, sometimes it's okay to do bad things, because we're doing the bad things to the bad people. Fight fire with fire. Get them before they get you. And so a noble cause can be corrupted when we operate with the idea that the end justifies the means, or the way to get there is okay. Now, just for an example, there's nothing wrong with trying to be and wanting to be the best you can be, right? Be the best you can be. Now, Adolf Hitler had that ideal, to let the German people be the best they can be. So he gets into this idea of a master race, to be the best you can be. And if we can create the best we can be, we can create a utopia, an ideal society. Well, what's wrong with creating an ideal society? Marxism had the same idea. We've got capitalistic thinkers today that think this is the way we can make the ideal society. So there's a philosophy, a theology, an ideology that wants to make things ideal, perfect. But once one decides that the end, the ideal, justifies the means, however, what you can do, whatever you can do to get there, then that makes it okay. But if you want to be the best you can be, which is an honorable goal, then if, say, you are going to run a race, then if you break the legs and poison all the other runners so that you can win the race, you can win the race and get the gold medal, but does that make you the best you can be? Did you not corrupt the goal, the ideal, by using unjust and unfair means to achieve it? So you're not the best that you can be. You violate another principle that might not have been thought of in the process of being the best you can be, a principle called sportsmanship. Another philosophy that would counteract the end justifies the means. In sportsmanship, the end does not justify the means. You cannot cheat. You cannot undermine the enemy or the opponent and make them less so that you can be superior. In sportsmanship, you challenge each other and each one gets better and better as you compete fairly. But anyway, in Nazi Germany, they tried to make a master race by killing off individuals and groups they viewed as inferior and corrupting influences. Now, another false idea of self-deception in struggles is the idea that might makes right. Might makes right. Y'all have heard that one. Which means if I'm strong enough to force my ideology about what is good and pure and true on others with my might and power, I decree what is good. And the minority just has to take it. And we see this in autocratic rules in communist countries of the past, and we saw it in the Roman domination in the early centuries, and the Pharaoh, and in our European divine right of kings. And we saw how the divine right of kings worked out. They ended up killing each other in order to be the ruler, and might made right. I mean, I think I shared this once. I used to feel proud that my ancestry went back to some minor nobles in England. I'm William, the Earl of Tankersley, and there's a place where over in England, in Liverpool area, where there's still a place. There's a chapel there in a Tankersley Manor, and in 1066, the first Tankersley was there, and the Ley of the name means the meadow. It's a place name. If there's a Lee at the end of a name, it has an English origin, French English origin, that goes back to a place name, because Lee means meadow, a particular meadow, a particular geographic spot where these people first were recorded as existing in history. Well, anyway, I saw Braveheart, the movie, and what I discovered there, if there's any truth to the historical basis of that, those who ruled were just the meanest, nastiest people in that age, and they killed off all their opponents. Might makes right is exercised often in history, but it doesn't necessarily make it true. Within Catholicism, there's the concept of the infallibility of the Pope. We've heard this. And basically, it just means those who follow the Pope give the Pope the right to define reality. If the Pope says something is bad, then by golly, it's bad. And if the Pope said something is good, then by golly, that makes it good for everybody who follows the Pope. But others who don't follow the Pope may disagree. That may not be correct. That may not be right. For example, in a world where we're getting more and more humans and fewer resources, and the perpetual impregnation and having babies weakens the body of women in third world countries, to say birth control is wrong, there are those who would say, we respectfully disagree. Just because you say it may make it right for your people. It doesn't make it an objective reality for everybody else. And lots of other issues we could discuss in that regard. But anyway, the might, the power to rule and make something right doesn't necessarily make it right. Now, the point of all of this is in regarding Gnosticism, which sees the world as black and white, all or nothing, good or evil. In conflicts, it often sides with folks who may have illegitimate claims to truth over against those who have legitimate claims to truth. And sometimes truth and rightness lie somewhere in between extreme positions. And if everything's black and white, then you don't get to discuss and negotiate and come to a closer truth and reality as you educate each other in your discussions. Let's see. Oh, here it is. I thought it was on the other page. I heard on the radio on NPR several days ago, someone was interviewing and they quoted Solzhenitsyn. And I thought this was the most brilliant statement. If you disagree, we can have a discussion about that. Sort of like I went to one of the Jewish clergy institutes, and there was in this argumentation with God and others, the whole style of the Jewish faith was described by one of their scholars as, we don't have it that much within Methodism because we're supposed to be teetotalers, but this story is about an old Jewish man sitting in the bar or the pub, and he's sitting there, and a young student comes in. And the old gentleman says to the young man, "So, how about an argument?" And that's their style. They will debate and discuss, and each learns in the process because they play by fair rules. They don't, if I'm losing the argument, I don't have my license to carry and pull out a gun and shoot you because I think you're wrong and you're evil, and I can eliminate you because you are evil because you're wrong. We can argue, we can debate, we can learn from each other in the process. But anyway, Solzhenitsyn had this line that the line between good and evil does not run between me and you, but runs down the middle of every human heart. We could end on that, but the Christian answer to all of this is a mixture, that we are a mixture of saint and sinner, and we're all in a process of learning and growing and maturing in grace, and we might be following a bad path and going the wrong direction and getting lost, but we have this concept of conversion, which means to turn and go a different direction. And that at any point in a person's life, they can turn. And that God's grace and love are not powerless to save the most warped and wretched human being as long as they're alive and have breath, that God at some point, sometime might turn them and claim them. But in the process, those of us who got turned and claimed early, we can go, as Wesley said, on to sanctification, work our way closer and closer to perfection. But all of us are on that continuum someplace. And some begin early and get pretty far along, and some begin early and get off the track and have to be pulled back. Some just are naturally gracious, kind-hearted people who don't happen to believe. But at some point down the road, they've been good, kind-hearted people, and then finally someday they make the connection that this goodness and kind-heartedness has something to do with God. And then they realize somehow God has been with me, guiding me, and I didn't know who that was. And now I do. So anyway, we see the dualism as wrong, but that there are two sides to us. There is evil, it does exist, but it's not a power in a Satan or an opposing God. It's just that free will or ignorance, or some of it is, it's bad, but it's not evil. Bad can be cancer. Bad can be an accident where I fall down and I break a leg or my hip. That's bad, but it's not evil. It creates pain and suffering, but pain and suffering happen to be our friend. Did you know that? Pain is our friend. You know what pain does? When something hurts, it says, something's wrong, do something different. Go to the doctor and get it fixed. Take your hand out of the fire. Wear shoes when you walk out there among the sandburs and the goat heads. Pain is our great teacher of how to avoid the hurtful, harmful things. It's really a bad thing when we've got bone cancer. But thanks be to God that we have pain medicines that have come along to help us. Oh my gosh. I've got a page and a half, and I found and I was going to deal with that statement that we do wrestle with God. We Methodists wrestle with God. In the New Testament, I think an example of that, what was Jesus doing in the wilderness for 40 days if he wasn't wrestling with God? Christianity has a story about wrestling with God. What was Jesus doing in the Garden of Gethsemane if he wasn't wrestling with God? Oh Lord, if this cup could pass, but no, thy will be done, not my will. And Paul, when he's persecuting the Christians and he gets thrown off the horse, when he tries to figure out, what am I doing? What should I do? He's wrestling with God, and God redirects his energy. And in the United Methodist Church, we've got our social principles where we wrestle with, should we be engaged in the world, and how? How should we show God's influence in the greater society? And I happen to find, where did it go? Oh, here it is. Our discipline has the social principles and all kinds of neat things in it. And this is a discipline that was printed in 1859. It is the Methodist Episcopal Church, South, printed after the split. And but the church was wrestling with slavery. And the split came when one of our northern bishops' wife, father or mother, died and left the plantation and the slaves, and they inherited them. And so here's a bishop of the church who owns a lot of slaves. And what are you going to do with them? It's not right to own other human beings. And his dilemma was, where they were, you can't just free them loose into a southern slave culture, somebody will just grab them up and take them as their own slaves. You have to have a process for liberating them and getting them to someplace safe. Well, in the time frame, he didn't act fast enough, and folks pushed too hard, and the Southern said, "You're pushing too hard. You can't do that. That's not right." The only resolution is we'll have to split apart. And that was the lightning flash or the catalyst that divided the church before our country divided. But anyway, there's interesting ways of expressing that I was going to share with you. But you want me to deal with some of that next week, or you want me to jump on and go with back into Genesis?
I would say deal.
Okay. Okay. Well, I see. Okay. I'll pick up and deal with. Oh, I ran over. Let's pray. Dear God, we thank you for Rabbi Sachs pointing out these very powerful concepts as the people of Israel tried to be your people. And the things they learned can teach us because we're trying to be your people as well. And to wrestle with the problems and the struggles in the world and not just fold our hands and say, well, we'll just wait till we go to heaven and let you work it out. You have called us to try to work it out and make this world a place where your spirit of love and compassion does rule. In Christ's name, amen. Well, thank you.